Hey, what's up? Welcome back. If you have ever worked with the invoice API using Stripe, you know that typically you need to create an invoice item or several invoice items before creating an invoice. And then when you create the invoice, it'll sort of sweep up those invoice items. We recently released a brand new attribute that you can pass when creating an invoice that will cause it to wait or exclude any pending invoice items and allow you to create a draft invoice that you can attach invoice items to and then finalize. This is extremely exciting because we've been hearing a lot of folks ask for this. So I'm going to go through the process today for the new flow that you might use for creating and finalizing invoices. We're going to use Visual Studio Code today, and we're going to create a new .NET Interactive notebook. Now, by default, it starts out as C#, but we're actually going to use Python today. So here we're going to save this as demo2.ipython notebook. And we want this to actually be Python, not C#. We're going to say import Stripe. Then we're going to set our API key to our API key, which we can grab from the docs or from the dashboard. And once we have our API key set, then we can run this cell. I'm just going to use this play button, and I'm going to select version 3.9.5. This is just a version of Python I have installed already. All right, let's add a new cell. We're going to add new code, and this is going to use the Stripe customer create snippet. We're going to pass in our description as just invoicing customer. We also need to pass an email address so that we can send an invoice to the customer. So here we'll just say jenny.rosen@example.com. We'll also give a name for Jenny. And we want to store the result of this API call in a new variable called customer. And for now, what we can do is just print out the customer's ID. Now, what's nice is this variable will be passed down to future cells. So we can run this with Control Enter. And now we see the ID of the customer printed out. The next step is to create an invoice. Now we can directly create the invoice. This is really exciting. So Stripe invoice create, and the customer that we're going to pass in is customer.id. Now we want to pass in this new parameter here, pending invoice items behavior, and we can set it to include and require, exclude. And so what we want to do is we want to actually exclude any pending invoice items that are on that customer. This might be invoice items that are part of a subscription. So when a subscription renews, invoice items are created and they're swept up when the invoice sort of cycles. But in the case that we want to send just a one-time invoice, we want to exclude any of those so that we have a draft invoice that we can work with. So I'm going to pass in exclude here. Now I also want to pass in an argument that allows us to specify that we don't want to collect automatically because this customer doesn't have a payment method yet. So I'm going to set the collection method to send invoice, and that should create an invoice for us. We can save this off as invoice. Now when we're passing send invoice as the collection method, we also want to pass some number of days until the invoice is due. So this is going to email the customer with a link to a hosted page where they can go and enter their payment details, and they need to pay the invoice by some specific date. So we can say days until due is 7. We'll give them 7 days to pay their invoice. And then finally, we'll just print out the invoice.id. And again, we can run this with Control Enter, and that is our new invoice ID. What's nice is that we can actually grab this. If we pull up the terminal here, we can use the Stripe CLI to say Stripe get, and then paste in the ID of the invoice, and that will retrieve the JSON for that invoice. So here we can see that the status of the invoice is in a draft, and there are no invoice line items for this invoice just yet. Okay, so that's going to be the next step. So here we're going to create an invoice item. So we'll say Stripe invoice items create. Great. So we need to pass in the customer, and we need to pass in some price data. So actually, we can also specify the invoice now. So we're going to say invoice.id, and then we also want to pass in price. Now we could pass in the ID of a price if we had one created already. I'm going to pass in price data to dynamically create a new ad hoc price. We're going to specify the currency is USD, and the unit amount is going to be, I don't know, $100, and we'll set the tax behavior to exclude. That means that we want to add taxes onto this if they're applicable. That'll happen on the hosted invoices page. And we're going to set the product to some product. Now to figure out what my products are, jump back into the terminal and use Stripe products list, and that will list out all of the products that I've configured in the Stripe dashboard. I'm just going to grab the ID of this first one and use that as our product. Okay, so this should create an invoice item for us, and we'll print out again its ID. Okay, Control Enter, and it crashed. Let's see, invalid price data tax behavior. It must be one of inclusive or exclusive. So I said exclude, so it should be exclusive. All right, run it again. All right, now we have the invoice item ID. So if we went to go grab this invoice again from the terminal, if we said Stripe get, paste in that invoice ID, then we will see that the status is still draft, but now we should have some invoice items, and we do. So this is the newly created invoice item inside of the lines. This is the new invoice item that we just created, and it's attached to that specific invoice. So that's fantastic. And the last thing we need to do is just finalize the invoice. So we can say stripe.invoice.finalize invoice and pass in the ID of the invoice. And then if we just print out invoice.id and maybe print invoice.status, then if we run this, we will see that we have an open invoice. So this is the ID of the open invoice. We could also, let's see, we also want to look at another property of the invoice, and that is going to be where we're going to send the customer, the end customer. So as part of the invoice object, we now have a hosted invoice URL and an invoice PDF. So they could download that if they wanted, but in practice, we're going to send them off to this URL. So let's take a look at what that is. So on the hosted invoice URL, this is like the URL to which you would send your customer to go pay their invoice. They can look at the invoice details here. They see that we're buying a test product, one of those for $100, and we can use several different payment method types if we wanted. And we're just going to use the test card today, and we will click pay. And that will successfully pay for the invoice. Now you can download an invoice PDF, or you can download the receipt for that invoice. But that is sort of the end-to-end flow now using this brand new pending invoice items behavior parameter. Very powerful stuff. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.